So I think. Oh, it's going to turn it.
Yeah, so it's just that part right there. Just wanna-
Did turn it off?
No. It's that.
Okay, can everybody hear me? Well, welcome to the beautiful Edith Bush Theater. I'm going to talk about the Edith Bush Theater in a little bit, just a little bit, but anyway, welcome. Thank you so very much for coming. My name is Rick Cronin. For about 30 years, I was a contractor here in Central Florida. I've been a resident of Central Florida for way long, 50 years or so. Came here from Ohio, so I'm not a native Floridian. But as a contractor, the more I drove around Central Florida, the more fascinated I became about its history, because there were so many place names and not nearly as many places. And so I often wondered about that. I mean, you can go almost anywhere in Central Florida. Let's say Lockhart. There's a little square there. There's a couple buildings, but not really much of a place. And there's locations like that all around Central Florida, and I wanted to find out why. And so when I had the luxury of retiring about a dozen years ago, I started researching. I researched Central Florida history for about 5 years before I wrote my first book, and it came out in 2013. And since that time, I've written about a dozen books and a handful of mini book series on special topics that were dear to me. But I really love talking about Central Florida history. And so I was really delighted when I was invited here to the Winter Park Library, and thrilled when I saw this beautiful theater in which I could be able to present myself to you. I am going to talk about lakes tonight, Winter Park lakes in particular. And the reason is the names. The names have always fascinated from the day back in the early 70s when I crossed Lake Ivanhoe in downtown Orlando. I thought, I wonder who Ivanhoe was. And yet I'd say to people, who was Ivanhoe? And they said, how am I supposed to know? I don't know. I don't care. So anyway, that was my predicament. But since that time, since I started writing books, I found a lot of people who do care. They're interesting. You're curious. Now, in a moment, I am going to get shortly, I'm not, but I promise I'll eventually get to the men on a Winter Park lake skiing in tutus, smoking cigars. I'll get to them eventually. But before I get to them, I would like to talk a little bit about namesakes, because that's what my title of my book is. It's Orlando Lakes, Homesteaders and Namesakes. And excuse me a little bit here, my allergies are acting up. I'm going to try not to clear my throat too often into the microphone, but my apologies for that. Namesakes is really kind of part of human nature. We've been naming things as far back as anybody can remember, I believe. And so when pioneers came down here, it was their first, the first challenge to them was to survive until the next day. But eventually they wanted to name something so that the world knew they were here. I know you're getting tired of seeing this picture, so I'll change the picture. You might have arrived here from Franklin Fairbanks Avenue or William Justice Lee Road, or maybe even came down Charles H. Morris Boulevard to get here. Those are all namesakes. I know the first names aren't involved in the names, but they are a part of Winter Park history, and they're for good reason. They were three individuals who did a lot for getting Winter Park started. Anytime I give a talk, I like to know where I'm giving my talk, because I'd always like to know if there's anything special about the place. The fascinating thing to me is I've probably given 35 or 40 talks in Central Florida, and I've yet to find a location that didn't have a fascinating history to it. So we are sitting in the Winter Park Library on Lake Menson. And I don't know, does everybody know who Menson is? We had dinner at the restaurant that is on the house where Mr. and Mrs. Menson used to live. Edward and Cornelia Menson owned a house right across Orange Avenue, and their house faced Lake Clarny. He came down here in the 1920s. He was a paper salesman in Chicago, got involved in Winter Park, and ended up being president of the Winter Park National Bank. He and Cornelia, his wife, were very, very active in civic duties here, and so Lake Menson, right across the street from his home, ended up being named for him. See, you already, that's one lake down already, and that's not even on the program. So the name of the theater is fascinating to me. Chicago, with this young, extremely good ballet dancer, actress, really, truly involved in the arts, and he was an accountant. And after a while, he said, you know what, this company I'm working for, I think has a future, but not here in Chicago. So she gave up her Chicago acting career and moved with him to Minneapolis. And she believes in him and his firm so much that it wasn't too terribly long that his Scotch tape was being sold all over the place. And he was able to help finance her into arts. And he helped her establish the Edith Bush Theater in Minneapolis. A critic from St. Paul went across the river and watched her act, and he was absolutely amazed. He said, she not only knows her lines, she knows the entire lines of the play. She lip syncs every actor, but she doesn't control the stage. She backs up to let the others perform. She really took Minneapolis by storm. So Edith Bush really became a very special person in the arts profession there. And then, after the Minnesota Mining and Manufacturing Company became a real success, Mr. Bush, Archibald Bush, and his wife Edith moved here to Winter Park. Now, there's more than one reason for me wanting to tell you this story, because this is her, not when she lived here, but when she lived maybe in Chicago, I don't know. But she was really considered. She was born in 1879 and died here in 1972. I try not to look at notes. I have bad eyesight, so every now and then if I look down, I'm really just trying to clear my eyes. I'm not really looking at notes, but every now and then I have to question myself, so I'll admit that I do look at my notes. So anyway, now we've got established Edith Bush and her husband Archibald coming here to Winter Park. In 1951, now they lived, I should say, at 1200 North Park Avenue. Their house actually looked out on the Lake Maitland, but they also dabbled in real estate. And Archibald Bush knew a lot of individuals around here, so they bought different properties and things. And so he and Edith bought a property in conjunction with several others, and they wanted to develop it. And they had to write up an extensive plat, legal description and all, in order to make that happen. And that fact that they did helps us immensely in telling the story of Winter Park. And I'll show you an example. In 1951, they entered into an agreement with the other property owners to make a development called Osceola Shores. And this was the legal description that they started writing up. Well, what helps historians like us, like me, is that in the legal description, they have to provide a lot of information that we may not necessarily know otherwise. And in this particular case, that mentions Lakeview and Deed Book J, page 167. And that is this document right here. The paper document doesn't exist anymore. It's actually, this is a photo of what was on microfilm. And the arrow points to lot 16, but it shows us so much more than just the fact that they were going to develop lot 16. First of all is the lake. The lake is called Lake Mayo, but it's been crossed out to Osceola. So like Lake Osceola originally started out as Lake Mayo. Lake Mayo, there was actually a large landowner by the name of Rudolph Mayo, and also a Marquis de Lafayette Mayo, who owned land kind of northwest of Lake Osceola. And if you drive through Maitland area to where the Maitland interchange is with 1792, there's actually a Mayo Street there. And that was where part of the Mayo property was. So this area it also started out with Lakeview, was the name of it. Now, to be clear, the plat shows the area east of Osceola, so Winter Park doesn't really show on this, the original Winter Park, which would have been west of Lake Osceola. If you could see, it's kind of hard to read, but up at in the very far left corner of this plat, it says Howell Creek. Interesting fact that Howell Creek was named that early. It also shows Sylvan Lake, Lake Mayo. So it's a kind of a interesting fact that this particular plat here was drawn about 1882, maybe 1881 at the earliest, by a gentleman by the name of Gwynn. So this basically shows a development here before the town of Winter Park came along. Now, I'm going to clarify something at this particular point in time. I have my files here. We're not going to have time to go through it, but I do want to clarify something. I was granted this invitation to come here because a couple of the folks that asked me to come here had come to a presentation that I gave at the Chamber of Commerce Winter Park for the Winter Park Historical Society. And I mentioned the fact that Lake Sioux and Lake Virginia were named. Number one, Lake Virginia was named by a gentleman by the name of Bowling Swoop, who came from Virginia, and that Lake Sioux was named by Mr. and Mrs. Russell, of which the wife was Sue. And somebody said to me, well, wait a minute, I read a book, and it said that George W. Boyers named Sue for his wife, and Virginia because he came from the state of Virginia. And so I said, look, I'll answer you in emails afterwards, which I did, or I tried to, but I'll stand by my decision. Now, the reason is that a lot of history that is written is not exactly correct. And when I start talking about history, I don't like to talk, as you will find out about one lake I get into later. I don't like to talk about something if I can't really feel 99.9% certain that I'm right. Now, there's always a chance that something else could come up. But when you're looking back into history, and the library asked me if I would this time, different from my first talk, go into a little bit more about how I go into my research, and that's why I showed that earlier deed. I like to make certain that I go to the earliest dated printed document that I can. So if a document exists in 1880 with a specific name to it, and somebody wrote something in 1948 about how something transpired, I will take the 1880 document over the 1948. The reason so much is that is in Central Florida here is because we had so many terrible calamities strike the pioneers here that we were constantly having a turnover. And so as you would if you ever choose to read my new book, Orlando, you will find that each time a calamity occurred, most of the people who knew what was going on around here left or died. And so consequently, we had new people coming in. And so they had to rely more on family stories that were handed down. And those family stories aren't always 100% correct. So here's how I came to my conclusion. This is a map that was made in 1890, and it shows G.W. Moyers. G.W. Moyers did, in fact, come from Virginia. His wife, this is his homestead. And it actually, if you look at the 15 where I got it circled there, that's his house in 1890 that was drawn by surveyor John O. Fries and has been relied upon by historians, and you can verify that this is correct. Moyers, when he came from Virginia, settled first here. But if you look at where here is, it's between Crane's Roost and Lake Pearl and Lake Lotus and Spring Lake. This is up in Altamont area. This is where he settled first. Now he had a mill. And then he very early on, he got interested in Winter Park. And so by the early 1882, 1883, he was in Winter Park clearing and selling land, or selling timber and so forth. But if you look back, in 1878, Bowling R. Swoop and his wife Helena, they actually sold a piece of property that in which they said that it went to a point on Lake Virginia. So Benjamin Swoop was already referring to Lake Virginia in 1878 before Mr. Moyers had gotten in his vehicle, his mule-drawn vehicle, to head south to Florida. And in 1882, William and Susan Russell were selling land. In their deed, they marked it Lake Sioux. So the earliest documented evidence points, as far as I'm concerned, to these individuals as naming it. Now, how important it is, it's not important really, I guess, until you write about it and somebody says, I think you're wrong. But anyway, that's the way it is. Let me see where I'm at here. All right, so in 1879, a civil surveyor called E.R. Trafford made a detailed map of Orange County. It's one of the best maps. I love it because for the longest time we thought one of the earliest maps that we could count on was 1890, but Trafford made one very detailed, and I think what was interesting about it is in 1879 he shows a number of lakes already named. Lake Osceola, so Mayo has already changed to Osceola, Mizell, Berry, Virginia, Killarney, and Maitland. So we're going to kind of take a little tour. But before I do that, there's even, we're getting into a couple other maps anyway. And just to show you, Osceola Post Office was actually opened in 1877. Winter Park Post Office opened in 1882, and at that time Osceola vanished. So the settlers, the pioneers, actually had originally started developing the east side of the lake and instead came to the west side. This is a map I love if you're into Winter Park history. If you haven't seen it, you can find it on the Library of Congress website just by entering Winter Park, Florida, 1885, and it'll pop up. This is hard to see, but the nice thing is if you call it up on your computer, you can zoom it right in and you can read everything on it. And again, it shows a lot of the same lakes, naturally, that they had not changed their names yet. All right, so need to start back a little bit and bring you up to date a little bit because we're starting out in the 1880s. I need to go back to 1836. In 1836, the area in which we live is that area in the box. In other words, this was nothing. This was considered Indian reservation. The Indians didn't necessarily live here. They traveled through this area, but although there were some areas that they've been found that the Indians did live in at that time. But there was no specific area where the settlers were. We had no individuals living in this area when the military came in, because north of this box, on Christmas of 1835, 16 plantations had been burned down. West of this area was where the Dade Massacre had occurred. So that brought the military in, and that changed everything. By 1843, when the troops left, the very first people to arrive were surveyors. So I'd like you to imagine this land. The squiggly line over here is the St. Johns River on the right-hand side. That very top of the red line is Mellonville. Right next to that would be Sanford. This line over here is today Lake County, Sumter County line, and the line on the bottom is Osceola County. If you came here looking for something, this is what you would find, except for the red line. The red line was a trail. It was a trail that left Mellonville and went to Fort Gatlin, which is south of Orlando. The star is basically it's in the area of Winter Park. So imagine yourself coming here, getting off a boat at the top of that line, and wanting to go to Fort Gatlin. You would see absolutely nothing but trees, dirt trail, and lakes. Nothing, and maybe a few wild animals, but nothing else. There were no houses, no stores, no people. That was what the very first surveyor, which is what I love about Central Florida history, a guy by the name of Benjamin J.F. Whitner came down here from Madison. He was a Florida surveyor, and he didn't start surveying up there. He came down here, and his very first survey was of the Fort Gatlin area, and there's very good reason for it. By 1846, 47, 48, other surveyors were wrapping up other areas, but Whitner ended up surveying all the way across and all the way down to Kissimmee City. Now that box that you're looking at is 6 miles wide, 6 miles wide, 36 square miles. Benjamin Whitner from that area down to Kissimmee had surveyed 570 square miles. And the reason was, and this is what has been overlooked by historians for over 100 years, is that in the late 1830s and the early 1840s, the discussion was how to get a railroad to Tampa Bay. The ships were having to go all the way around the Keys to get to New Orleans, and if they could only get access to Tampa Bay, they could open up a whole new era for New Orleans, because to get goods from New York or Savannah was a long way around to New Orleans. So this man was not so much, I mean, he was here to survey, but he was really looking for a path for a railroad. Now, there's a lot of proof as documentation about him as being assigned by the governors of Florida to do different things. But one of the biggest proofs is right where that star is, right where Fort Gatlin is, he bought his first land. He bought 270 acres, so he had an vested interest in Central Florida from the get-go. All right, where that red spot is was a place called John's Hole. John's Hole, now it is funny, I know that, but Will Wallace Harney first wrote in 1870 of John's Hole. It was really a story, I believe, I'm almost 100% convinced he made it up, but this was a story about a poor John who lived down on Lake Conway. His wife raised chickens, and his only job was he had to deliver the chickens to the Orange House Hotel at Fort Reed, which is right near Mellonville in Sanford area. That's his only job, so he could deliver the chickens to the hotel so that they could serve chickens. Well, old poor John, when he left out of Lake Conway, he made it any time he made the trip, he made it as far as the watering hole right near Fort Maitland. But his poor old mules or oxen were so thirsty that they started down into the lake before John could stop them, and he ended up losing his ox, his wagon, and whatever. Everything, the chickens, everything, but he did save himself. So that became the legend of John's Hole. It ended up being republished by the South Florida Railroad in 1886, and then it was republished again by E.H. Gore in 1951 in his History of Orlando. So this was John's Hole. We know it today as Lake Lily, and I don't think Maitland wants to promote the fact that it was originally. But Will Wallace Harney said the romance of John's Hole, in which reckless John lost his poultry and poultry wagon years ago, is converted into a cow pasture and stockyard. After that time, it was converted into a lovely lake for us to enjoy. Lake Killarney. Lake Killarney dates to all the way back to 1875. And that was named by Martin Conway, who came here from Ireland. He was one of the very first settlers of the area. This line over here on the right is from a survey of 1846. And what that shows is the Fort Mellon, Fort Gatlin Road, that red line. But in here, it shows it going right by Lake Killarney. So that's how Lake Killarney got named. He came down here. Conway was not in any way related to Lake Conway, but he was an early merchant, and he ended up later on moving down a little bit further to Wilcox, which is today the Lake Ivanhoe area. All right, so now we go to William R. Spear and Lake Spear. He was described as a quiet man known as Whispering Bill. Whispering Bill, we kind of assume, is somehow related to the Spear that took over the store in downtown Orlando. It hasn't really been, he was about the same age. We haven't really been able to confirm that. But anyway, Lake Spear was named as early as 1879. How do we know that's him? We can verify it because at the Bureau of Land Management, also known as the General Land Office, they recorded everybody's homestead, and this is W.R. Spear is shown as in 1878 as having his homestead. He would have had to wait 5 years to get that deed. So he was here early, and we can know by the township and range and section survey information, which was prepared by surveyors like Benjamin F. Whitner, as to zeroing in and saying, okay, he's there on his own lake. Another similar is, in the same area, is Henry H. Berry. Henry H. Berry went to Orlando, opened up a wagon shop. He decided to move that shop to Winter Park, and he became one of the very early wagon makers. And so he ended up having his homestead on Lake Berry. On that map I showed you, you can see that Spear is named, but below that is a very large lake that is not named. That is, that's an interesting story. And let me give you a little background as to how you zero in to understand that. Notice that section 16 of this particular survey area is right on top of the lake. This is a modern-day Rand McNally map that I use. The pages are torn and tattered because I've used it so much. But this, you can take a Rand McNally Street Atlas of Orlando, and you can start doing your own plotting of your family homesteads or homesteads of individuals you know. If you take this and see these little circles with the lines in them, those are the corners of each section. The map will tell you what township and range you're in. They have dotted lines showing the township and range. So you can actually zero in on your particular property off of a map like this. There's 16, 15. This over here is the surveyor's guide. This is when they surveyed back in the 1840s. This is how they did it, 6 miles by 6 miles. And then after they did a 6 mile square, they went back and they further divided into 1 square mile sections to end up with 36 sections. And they always numbered the sections this way, 1 up in the upper right, 1 to 6 and back like that. So 15 and 16, 9, 10, 15 and 16 is right here for this particular section where Lake Baldwin is at. There's 2 unnamed lakes that I'm going to get to in here. Fascinating stories, I think. Lake Baldwin and Lake Compton. All right, so now you know Lake Baldwin. But the thing is Lake Baldwin is a kind of a young guy. He's no longer alive today, but he was with the U.S. Navy. So Lake Baldwin did not get its name, Baldwin, until the Navy base came. So prior to the Navy base arriving, and even for a while the Navy base was here, it was known by a different name. In 1886, a guy by the name of Hugh McCallum came from Scotland, fell in love with Central Florida, went back to Scotland and started selling pieces of his land, and he ended up buying lot 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5, he found buyers for all 5 lots, and then the next year he died. A real bummer because we don't know anything more about the man. But we do know that on his plat, he named his lake Lake Cronin. So to a guy like me, the first thing I have to say is, who was Cronin? How do we find out about who Cronin was? And what about the pond on Lot 5? Because the pond on Lot 5 was not named. I can tell you this about McCallum. According to the Winter Park history here, McCallum's house still exists. He didn't live out there. He sold all of his land. He actually built a house on Lake Sylvan, and that house is still standing today. If you go back to the 1880s, you can see the McCallum house as being shown on Sylvan Lake, exactly where the house that I just showed you is located. This is kind of an interesting thing to me because I'm also a railroad historian fanatic. In 1880 now, Winter Park didn't exist yet. Osceola did, we know. But in 1880, one of the founders of a train that was going to run from Lake Eustis to Orlando was E.B. Livingston, Colonel Livingston also lived on Sylvan Lake. He first came to Winter Park. So presumably, the railroad was to come to Winter Park in Orlando. I have a suspicion that that's why we have what I call the bend in the road. Because from Maitland, the railroad stopped following the Fort Mellon to Fort Gatlin Trail for a while and took this very, very odd bend out of the way to get over to Osceola. The first station name was Osceola. It then became Winter Park. And then it had to come all the way back over to follow the trail on into Orlando. So there was some influence going on in there. Livingston, no doubt, was partly responsible for that. All right, so we're back to we're almost where we started here, right? The guys in the, this article appeared in the Orlando Sentinel, and it was for a special event that I think it was Cypress Gardens had put on for the people at the Orlando base. And yeah, the guys really did wear tutus and were smoking cigars. But the ski show appeared on Lake Cronin. Which brings me to this question, is it Cronin or is it Cronin? Because if you drive out East Winter Park Road and turn left onto Cronin Drive, you end up with Corrine. But when Corrine was paved back in the 1920s, it was called Lake Cronin Drive. And as usual, I mean, not as usual, but as I've seen it more than often once, Weber Street in downtown Orlando is a real good example. The sign makers decided to change the name, apparently. So as best we can determine, the name was really Cronin, although one of the very early developments where East Winter Park ended and turned onto Cronin Drive, it was spelled Corrine. So I don't know that we can absolutely blame it on the sign makers. But somewhere along the line, the realtors themselves got confused. There was an Oakhurst subdivision there, and as you can see, in this ad that was run in the paper, they spell it with the two R's, and yet this very same outfit started advertising it with the other spelling in it. So, before I tell you about Cronin, I need to tell you about the empty lake, because I've been itching to get to this. This is a funny story. I mean, this is an unusual story. It's a good story for the historian that is sitting and want to be in the audience, because I don't really have the answer to this, what happened here. As I said, it was unnamed for many, many years. It is now known as Lake Compton. It's a very small lake. It's surrounded by houses, basically. I don't think you can even get to it. In 2002, the name of Fred Compton, who owned that property, passed away. And in his obituary, it talked about the fact that he taught at St. Margaret Mary's Church here in town. I think that's Maitland, right? Yeah, Winter Park. Okay. Oh, that's right, Winter Park. Wrong church. Glenridge Junior High, Mount Dora High, and he even planted 250 trees in Mount Dora. Really nice guy, spoken of, thought of very highly, very well-known teacher. But when he bought the property, his name was Fred H. Sorrow. His wife was Virginia Sorrow, and they bought Lot 5 of McCallum subdivision, which is now Lakemont. And then in 1960, they filed, and the Orange County allowed the husband, the wife, and all three children to change names. So Fred Hiram Sorrow Jr. became Fred Monroe Compton. Now here's the part for the future historian. I don't know why he changed. I don't know if we even, maybe we aren't supposed to know why he changed. But oddly enough, a gentleman by the name of Sorrow became Mr. Compton, bought land, and the lake on his property became Lake Compton. You see, there's still mysteries in this area we haven't figured out. Oddly enough, 2 years after he changed his name, and y'all might have heard or know of this, but anyway, there was a jet was taken off from Paris after all of the Atlanta arts and crafts people, the high people that involved in the arts, they had gone to Paris and they were taking off on the way back home, and the plane crashed and killed all of them. It was a huge loss to the city of Orlando, or to Atlanta. And one of those individuals was Mrs. Sorrow, who was Fred Compton's stepmother. Tragic loss, but so be it. Now, as far as Corinne, and before I go on to my next one, I should say this. Corinne, I have dug down, I have probably spent way too much time trying to find out Corinne. I would guess 3-4 days. I love researching. When I go after something, I'm really not happy until I find the answer to it. So sometimes I spend way too much time digging. I have a daughter, I think, that has similar traits. She spends way too much time on certain projects. I found out there was like 3 or 4 Corinnes here in Orlando. 3 of them were way after the first name was shown. Another one, I couldn't connect at all to that particular area. There is some possibility that Corinne was a McCallum. I was able to find Hugh McCallum. Who Corinne was, bother, it's called Lake Baldwin now. Now, Deeks is another interesting story because Reverend Greenberry, I believe his name, Deeks, brought his wife and children to Central Florida here and settled in the 1870s. And he actually had a homestead that had 3 lakes on it. The Reverend's wife's name was Florence. Florence was into gardening, and so they ended up with Lake Florence and a garden lake on the property. And the 3rd was named for an Orange County school superintendent, his son, Beeks, Beeks. In 1890, when John Freese made his map, he showed the lake as Becks. And somewhere along the line, it became Deeks, and to this day, if you look on, this is Seminole County's property tax information, they call it Lake Deeks. So Deeks, there's an answer to one of your questions on the quiz, is who was the superintendent, but it was then Deeks ended up. All right, what's next? Hopefully I haven't bored y'all yet. There's the map. This is the 1890 map that shows Garden Lake, Lake Florence, and Lake Becks. And that has since become Lake Deeks. And let me say, that's not unusual. Reed is one of the most convoluted names in Central Florida history. It's R-E-E-D and R-E-I-D. And to fill it out, one time they made it R-E-A-D. So it was like read. But anyway, surveyors quite often misspelled. Their maps were very, very detailed. They were really good at making maps, but they were terrible at spelling names. And I probably can't say a whole lot about spelling, so I'm going to leave it at that. So this is how I kind of came up with the idea. Most of my books are about history. All of my books are about history, but most of my books are written in a history narrative format. Over the years, every time I came across the lake, I'd jot something down. And so I need to make the clear is that Orlando Lakes, Homesteaders and Namesakes is more of an encyclopedia than it is a written history. I've had a couple people say, I read your book cover to cover. And I said, really? Wow. I mean, that's like getting out the encyclopedia and reading it cover to cover. I thought that was fascinating, thank you. But really what it was designed for is a coffee table book for when somebody says, I wonder how that lake got named. Well, I think so. And what you find is on every single lake has a reference where you can go verify it. All right. And then just recently I came out with my latest book, one that I've been working on for over a decade, and that is Orlando. Now, you might say, well, you're in Winter Park, what are you doing selling Orlando? The story of Orlando applies to everything in Central Florida. it's kind of where things started because one family really was determined to have an Orlando. And until you follow story, decade by decade by decade, you don't really get the whole feel of it. But Orlando was very, very intentional, and it was intended to be a county seat. It was critical to be a county seat. And the fact that in 1880 we had 200 towns in Central Florida, Orange County mostly, 200 different towns, only a handful survived, but the ones that did were county seats. County seat meant a town would survive. Now I want to tell you about one other lake that's near and dear to me, and that's this one. This has got me into Central Florida history. Lake Adelaide. Lake Adelaide, everybody know where Lake Adelaide is. Highway 436, Maitland Avenue ends right at 436, and on the north side of 436 is a beautiful lake called Lake Adelaide, and it has an amazing history of Central Florida. But more so was I lived very near Lake Adelaide. I lived on a road called Lake Adelaide, and if I looked real careful between the spaces and the houses across the street on the right, I could see the lake. I mean, it was like I knew that the lake was there. But I always liked walking around to the 701 building because there you had a great view of the lake. I first saw the lake in 1974. I had only been in Central Florida for a very short time, extremely short time. And I went out there because I had a potential customer that wanted to get a loan, and so he took me out, and he took me up to the top floor of the 701 building, which is an A-frame building, and he wanted to put a club in there. And he said, this is what and he was telling me everything he had in mind. He said, let me show you the best part of it. And we went out, and on the back of the 701 building is a open porch that is on the 5th floor now, and it looks down on the lake. And when I walked over and I looked down, I saw the bubbling. I saw Altamont Spring. And I never really knew it until years later because about 1976, they plugged it for a parking lot. We do strange things in Central Florida. Altamont Spring, that experience really led me to wanting to write a fictional story about 19th century Central Florida. And so to do that, I needed to do some research because I had no knowledge of 19th century Central Florida. So I started digging into it, and I ended up writing 12 history books instead. Another fascinating lake is right around that I didn't cover for you yet is Lake Mayo. Lake Mayo is an interesting lake to me. It's right around the corner. It's a long established winter park lake. I was writing a book called The Rutland Mule Matter. It is about the only Civil War story that occurred right here in Central Florida that was never written about. And it's included an individual in the center of that cover by the name of Isaac N. Rutland. Most people had never, ever heard of him. In 1861, Florida cast 2 no votes for secession. 2 people went to decide the fate of Florida. Both voted no. When you write about, or when you read William Blackman's history of Orange County in 1927 and most others, you will read that 2 people voted no. William W. Woodruff was one of them. Well, I don't know if it was just me, but I would always say, well, who was the other one? Tell me about who the other guy was. Well, it was about a guy that was written out of Central Florida history. His name was Isaac N. Rutland. The state of Florida, House of Representatives, every 2 years updates a roster from 1822 all the way up to present time. When I was researching that, I wrote, and I took my research and I sent it to the House, and I said, you're leaving somebody off of this roster. Isaac N. Rutland is not on your roster. And I got a reply back saying, thanks for your research, but we don't think he should be on there. And because this is for lawmakers. And I said, wait. So I wrote back and I said, wait a second. Isaac and Rutland voted no, but he stuck around to participate in writing the new Constitution for the state of Florida. That made him a lawmaker by definition. If you look at the state of Florida roster to this day, you will find Isaac and Rutland on that list. One of the most I took on City Hall and won, and I love it for that. But what's fascinating about Isaac and Rutland is he voted no because he was so dead set against slavery and the Florida secession leaving. And so he stayed here, and it cost him his life. He died. He was killed, put it more bluntly. And then he was written out of history. The Rutland Mule matter is probably, I get more comments. I did a presentation, and one lady came up with tears in her eyes and said, I'm Vic. Well, Vic is part of the Rutland family. She says, that's my great-grandfather I never knew anything about. So that's another thing I love about Central Florida history is I love to find people who say, wow, you told me something about my people that I never knew. And so that Lake Mayo, how does that come in here? Well, in 1858, Isaac Rutland supposedly sold his homestead to Mayo. But he didn't, supposedly. Now, in the 1880s, after Rutland was already dead and written out of history, there was a comment that said, Isaac sold me his land, but didn't have a chance before he died to make out a bill of sale. So Mayo ended up with his property. Now, how much of that is true, who knows what went on in 1858. But it ties Isaac Rutland right into here because Isaac went over and settled on the Wekiva River instead of coming to here. This is the deed that I'm talking about, in particular 1881, when the property of Lake Mayo was deeded to and Joshua Mayo, I believe. J.R. Mayo, I think is what it was. All right, and to wrap up, I want to go back to thank Winter Park Library because, as I said at the start, they attended a talk that I gave at the Winter Park Historical Society over at the Chamber of Commerce. That talk came about because a good friend of mine at the History Center wrote to me and said, we're trying to figure out how Lake Bell and Lake Midget got named. Can you help us out? And Killarney. So I wrote back and I said, well, Killarney's in my Orlando Lakes book. And I'll send you a copy of it. And she says, no, if it's in that book, I'm going to buy it. And so she bought it. And then I said, Bell and Midget, I don't know about it. I'll look into it. Midget, I wrote back and I said, Midget was a later subdivision. I'm not even sure that the lake existed. So I think that's just a much later named lake. Bell, I said, I'm spending days trying to find out. There were, sometimes ladies were called Bell, so-and-so. There were families named Bell. When I do my research, I have to understand it's not necessarily just because my name is Cronin. It may be my grandparents. It might be my wife's maiden name. So I go through all this, and I said, after several days, I said, I think I finally got the answer about your Lake Bell. And this is it. Turn the map sideways. I do hope that you enjoyed this. Let me go over the quick answers of the test for those who took it. I won't ask you if you passed it or not. No Sorrow, Lake Compton. Poor John, Lake Lily. No More Mayo, Lake Osceola. For Lovers, Virginia. Virginia's for lovers. School superintendent is Beeks, not Deeks. Wagon Wheel is Barry, and Forgotten Poetry is Baldwin. I didn't read you some of the poetry. I will post it. There are the salespeople in the 1920s, during the Roaring 20s. There were some imaginative salespeople, not to mention people that made some incredible promises about land. But they used to always write poems. And so there was a lot of poems, and so there's actually some poems that mention Cronin, and I think I do have just the one final. Let me see if I can find it here. Well, I guess I'm not. But anyway, I will post it on my Citrusland, Florida Facebook page if you follow me. If not, I certainly invite you to. It's a private. I accept anybody who asks to join it, but you don't believe how many duck cleaning people I have to delete every time, and that's why you have to get permission. I have to approve your post. I will accept any history-related post, even book sales, but I will not approve duck cleaning. So anyway, that is pretty much my presentation. I hope you enjoyed it. I will be happy to answer any questions that there might be. Thank you. I will be out back here, so if you have any questions, I'll be happy to field them there too. Thank you so much for coming.